Andrew Wilson, Professor of Ukrainian Studies here at UCL. We have 6 speakers, so we'll have to be strict on the 15 minutes maximum each, so we can get through on time. Our first is Professor David Marples from the University of Alberta, well known to you all, an old friend of UCL. In fact, the giver of the 6th special lecture back in 2021 here at UCL. And he'll be talking on the creation of a dictator, the path to the Lukashenka presidency. David.
All right, thank you very much. Pleasure to be back here in London. I'm a little jet lagged, so if I look weary, that's the reason why. You know, we talked about Toronto. Well, Toronto's almost halfway to London from where I came from, so much further to the west. I wanted to talk about the creation of a dictator today, and it's an article I wrote. I'm not going to try to read the article because it's 7,500 words. So I'll just try and summarize, and I'll miss quite a lot out. But I was interested in the period around the early 1990s and the politics of the people around Lukashenko and how he actually emerged as the president. And he was perhaps not the most likely candidate. And I argue that there are a number of factors that advanced his cause, but there were also means to stop him being president. But these possibilities were never taken. And I was struck by the demise not only of his partners, not only of opponents, but also of his backers and partners, the people who pushed his candidacy and were eventually cast aside. And the personnel of the 1990s crystallized into the leaders of the main opposition party in the years of the Lukashenko presidency. And what is most telling and ironic is that the people who helped advance Lukashenko's political career were precisely those who were his first victims or his main political opponents in the decades that followed. And it suggests a gross underestimation, of course, of Lukashenko's abilities or a naivety at his malevolence or ruthlessness, even though there were signs at the outset that he was determined to seize power, and he wouldn't be averse to using all kinds of means to do that. I'll go back to the period in January 1994 when the Belarusian Supreme Soviet voted to remove Stanislav Shushkevich from his position of chair of the assembly. Shushkevich, who passed away on May 4, 2022, at the age of 87, had been in office for about 30 months, but he presided over some of the most remarkable events in the history of the Republic. But he began his tenure earlier, and in September 1991, he was there when the now we've got Belarusian or Belarusian here, but let's just call it BSSR, it's easier, was renamed the Republic of Belarus. And 3 months later, he hosted the December 1991 meeting at Vyskuly in the Belarusian forest with his Russian and Ukrainian counterparts, Boris Yeltsin and Leonid Kravchuk, to create the Commonwealth of Independent States to remove Gorbachev. And Shushkevich found himself in a parliament divided between a strong majority of communists with about 302 seats, led by Prime Minister Vyacheslav Kevich, and a small opposition of between 25 and 37. I actually got this from Andrew Wilson's book, 25 to 37, headed by the leader of the Popular Front, Zyanon Pazniak, and who just turned 80, by the way, just 2 days ago, another auspicious occasion. And Pazniak's goal, like that of the Popular Front as a whole, was to hold new elections to replace the 1990 Supreme Soviet and ensure that the new constitution being drawn up for the state ensured a strong parliament to watch over a future president. The Popular Front, which became a formal political party only in 1993, gathered over 440 signatures in support of a petition for a new election. And that's well over the illegal amount needed of 350,000. But they didn't have any impact on this communist-dominated parliament, or for that matter, on Shushkevich. In the summer of 1993, Shushkevich faced a vote of no confidence, having failed to gain the support of either the majority communists or the Popular Front-led opposition. But he became ill, and the vote was therefore delayed. And when there was another attempt to remove Shushkevich, according to his own memoirs, the people who were doing it were so confident that they were to get him out of office, so they all went for a cup of coffee. And while they're out for coffee, they had the vote, and he survived. But he did say that he realized that the very next time that there was such a vote, he would be removed. At the time, his main concern was a proposed military security union with Russia, backed by Kevich's prime minister, that he considered would erode Belarusian sovereignty. At that time, he'd already agreed to send nuclear weapons from the Republic to Russia for dismantling. And at this stage, one can say that Lukashenka entered the scene, a former state farm leader and former KGB border guard who was seeking to make a name for himself after being elected to the Supreme Soviet in 1990. And according to the memoirs of Wojciech, Lukashenko took advantage of the fact that the meetings of the Supreme Soviet for the first time were covered by television and radio, and on the most crucial questions that they took place live. And he said that Lukashenko appeared at the microphone several times every day, no matter what topic was being discussed. For example, he commented on the shortage of women's stockings, the education system, abortion, and nuclear disarmament. And although the microphones were in good working order, Lukashenko bellowed into them with, in the words of Vasil Biko, a shrill, indignant voice. A nasal whine, I think is how I might describe it, but we all know that voice. And despite such energetic participation, Deputy Lukashenko did not take part in the drafting of any laws or routine office work that did not ensure publicity. In spring 1992, it was Lukashenko proposed adding to the agenda of the parliament the question of Belarus joining the Collective Security Treaty Organization. But that did not isolate Lukashenko in the assembly because his opinions were held by most deputies. In his memoirs, Shushkevich notes that he could never find a single teacher, professor, classmate, or fellow student who would confirm that Lukashenko was not only a solid student, but even a worthwhile one. But his breakthrough came when he was elected the temporary head of a parliamentary commission on corruption created by Shushkevich, ironically following a scandal involving Kevich's wife, Yelena. And he was nominated for that position by the youthful deputy, Anatol Gabetsky. One of Lukashenko's main acolytes was Viktor Hanchar, who would run his 1994 election campaign and later become deputy chair of the parliament. And they were part of a group called the Young Wolves, and also included Henadz Karpenko, the mayor of Melodechna, another rising political figure who was also a scientist and inventor. In his biography of Lukashenko, Feduta notes wryly that, quote, "So our main hero finally finds the matter that determined everything in his fate from the hands of those who at that moment did not even think about possible consequences." Shushkevich maintains that Lukashenko didn't like these people who were pushing him forward. He despised them, even relying on them to appoint him to this post. And, quote, he hated them because they were smarter, better looking, truly educated, especially because they were intelligent people, which for him, of course, was totally unattainable. And the statement's a good indicator of how his adversaries consistently understated or failed to perceive Lukashenko's undoubted political skills. And these events took place in the background of a catastrophic clash in Russia between the president and the parliament. President Yeltsin and a Russian parliament led by Alexander Rutskoy and Ruslan Hasbulatov, which came to a head in October 1993. And in this clash, the Belarusian parliament, for the most part, was supporting the members of the Russian parliament against Yeltsin. Shushkevich was backing Yeltsin. And when Yeltsin was victorious, one would have thought that Shushkevich's position suddenly became much stronger than it had been before. And not only Shushkevich, but also the Popular Front had supported Yeltsin. So the Popular Front then had the idea that they could now remove Kevich from the Council of Ministers as long as Shushkevich supported it. But they also mounted a campaign to deprive Lukashenka of his parliamentary powers, compromising the independence of Belarus by supporting membership of the CSTO. Though Shushkevich had agreed to work with Kevich, the Prime Minister was in fact closer in views. I can't really call him Prime Minister, Chair of the Parliament. He was closer in views to Lukashenka, and probably would not have agreed to Lukashenka being stripped of his powers of deputy because there was no such procedure for a move. But Lukashenka retained the support of the very active parliamentary faction that had backed him: Hanchar, Dmitry Bulakov, Fedute, Lebedska, and another group that had gathered around him to further their careers, but were not themselves dynamic actors, but probably well known to all of us: Viktor Shaiman, Leonid Sinitsyn, Ivan Tichenkov. How are we doing? 2 minutes. 2 minutes, okay. I thought it would be close. All right. Well, this is a disaster, but anyway. Suffice it to say that the Popular Front had a meeting with Shushkevich, which turned out to be a disaster. They could meet no common ground, and Shushkevich refused to take any action because it went against parliamentary procedures. Kazniak got very frustrated and he said, "You don't understand us, you have no idea what you're talking about." And the two of them had an irrevocable split. But I'll finish by saying what has happened since then. And the results are completely disastrous. We know what happened to Viktor Hanchar. He was kidnapped off the streets and murdered. Pasniak is in exile in Poland, having fled Belarus 2 years into Lukashenka's presidency. The Popular Front was liquidated on August the 14th, 2023. And every political party has since been removed. The lesson perhaps is that dictatorships are not always predictable, but they're often preventable. And in this case, one emerged from a democratic election, won in 1994 by Lukashenko over his closest rival, Kevich, but facilitated by young Democrats who were looking for power themselves and wanted to use Lukashenko like a truncheon to get rid of all the opposition so that they could eventually move into those positions. And it was a disastrous policy because the result was that Lukashenko himself took power and basically removed them from any political position that they'd had. The population perhaps wanted neither the status quo nor radical change. And Lukashenko realized that the Belarusian population at the present time gave him an opportunity to exploit the situation and win the first election for independent Belarus. So a really abbreviated version of this paper. I had a part on Clinton's visit and other things as well. But anyway, enough for now. Thank you.
We can reel back to that in Q&A.
Yes.
Thank you. Our second speaker is Robert Gabriel Țicălău, both from the Romanian Center for Russian Studies and doing a PhD at the University of Bucharest. He will speak on towards Soviet totalitarianism, the evolution of the Belarusian regime after the 2024 parliamentary elections.
Thank you. 15 minutes only.
Yes, please.
Yeah. After Alexander Lukashenko won the 1994 presidential election, he created a regime in which he sought to control the entire country. That's why since 1995, 3 referendums were held in Belarus, following which its citizens renounced their national identity in favor of a Soviet one, maintained the death penalty, and extended the powers of the president. Moreover, in 2022, Belarusians augmented Alexander Lukashenko prerogatives as they granted him the right to run the country until 2035 and to head the Belarusian People's Assembly, a new institution that will re-legitimize him as leader at their expense. My paper examines the evolution of Belarusian regime following the 2024 parliamentary elections, showing that after the vote, it continued its transition into Soviet totalitarianism. In other words, in the article, I argue that although initially Lukashenko tried to justify the holding of elections by citing the need to maintain Belarus stability under a pretext of an alleged attack by the West, he aimed to preserve the parliament decorative role composed only of faceless officials reminiscent of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. About the electoral system, according to the Constitution, the House of Representatives is elected for a 4-year term. The lower house of the parliament consists of 110 deputies elected based on general, free, equal, direct right to vote by secret ballot. Suffrage is granted to those Belarusian citizens who are at least 18 years old on the day of the election, and the right to be elected to the House of Representatives is given to citizens who are at least 21. Parliamentary elections were held in Belarus on 25 February 2024. Although the recent election campaign was the first one organized after the 2020 crisis, when huge protests against electoral fraud rocked the country. Following a presidential vote, it was the most boring one, as the Belarusian regime seeks to maintain the appearance of a democratic one, preferring instead to assume the identity of a hegemonic authoritarian regime in process of transitions into Soviet totalitarianism. However, the transition began after February 2022 referendum, when Belarusians augmented Alexander Lukashenko prerogatives, as they granted him the right to run the country until 2035 and to lead the Belarusian People's Assembly, a new institution that will legitimize him as leader at their expense. This new body, ironically called, quotation, the highest representative body of Belarusian democracy, end of quotation, will approve the domestic and foreign policy directions, along with the country's most important programmatic documents, military doctrine, the national security concept, and socio-economic development programs. Moreover, the Belarusian People's Assembly will not be composed of representatives of the Belarusian people elected every 5 years, but of 1,200 delegates, members of Belarusian nomenclature, including deputies, ministers, judges, deputies of local councils, and representatives of civil society, all loyal to the president. However, after the adoption of the new constitution, he argued that the election of the president by the people should be abolished, arguing that, quotation, the election campaigns destabilize Belarusian society, end of quotation. Instead, Lukashenko suggested that the future head of state should be appointed by a majority vote of delegations in the Belarusian People's Assembly, referring to the Chinese political system, where the country's leader is elected by the National People's Congress. Citing the need to maintain the stability of the country under the pretext of an alleged attack by the West, a few months after the referendum on amending the constitution, the members of the Belarusian government started the process of harmonizing the country's legislation, thus confirming their intention to accelerate the transition of the Belarusian regime from hegemonic authoritarianism into Soviet totalitarianism. At the end of August 2023, the ministers adopted in a meeting chaired by Alexander Lukashenko a new version of the electoral code that blocked the formation of new opposition parties, such as the increasing of minimum number of founding members from 1,000 to 5,000, and the obligation to open branches in at least 1/3 of the country's regions. Moreover, the members of the executive decided not to open polling stations in embassies abroad, and did not publish the names of election commission members to avoid public pressure being applied to them, and prohibited taking photos of ballot papers. Unlike previous parliamentary elections, the Central Election Commission did not invite observers from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, although it routinely monitors elections even in the most undemocratic states, such as Turkmenistan. Later, the permanent representative of Belarus in international organizations in Vienna claimed that, quotation, the reason for this are clear and simple, namely the traditional dominance of representatives of Western countries in OSCE missions, the imposition of unjustified and tough sanctions by Western countries, and the deterioration of logistical opportunities in the movement of its citizens to and from the country, end of quotation. The Central Electoral Commission preferred instead to issue invitation to election commissions to the members from anti-Western international organizations, such as the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or the Commonwealth of Independent States. Moreover, last summer, the Belarusian Ministry of Justice liquidated all opposition parties, allowing only four pro-governmental parties to take part in the 2024 parliamentary elections: Belarus, the Republican Party of Labor and Justice, the Communist Party, and the Liberal Democratic Party. On 29 January 2024, Alexander Lukashenko expressed confidence that the voting would be held calmly, as he claimed that, quotation, "The period is so difficult, but as you can see, it passes calmly. And I'm sure we'll approach these dates and hold these events just as calmly," end of quotation. However, days before the election, he accused the West of trying to destabilize the Belarusian society, claiming that the Polish authorities were trying to convince senior Belarusian officials to switch their allegiance as part of the coup plot. Moreover, a few days later, wanting to maintain the order in the country, Lukashenko did not miss the opportunity to call on law enforcement to carry weapons and to patrol streets of Belarusian cities during the parliamentary vote. Although they had taken all the necessary measures to ensure that the results of this year's legislative elections were highly predictable, the Belarusian authorities remained nervous ahead of the vote, eager to gain as much as internal legitimacy as possible and to turn Belarusian citizens into a highly disciplined electoral mass, just like in a Soviet totalitarian regime. They forced them to vote exclusively during the early voting. Thus, between 20 and 24 February, teachers, employees of state-owned enterprises, doctors, and police officials were threatened to vote, risking, in case of refusal, to get fired. On the eve of the vote, special forces conducted training during which they simulated the repressive measures they were going to apply to Belarusian citizens who violated electoral legislation. Despite the deployment, on 25 February, the commandos detained a voter photographing a ballot paper and exposed people gathered in artificial lines in front of a polling station. The results of the Belarusian parliamentary elections held on February 25 of February 2024 confirmed the decorative nature of the legislative, as the House of Representatives continue to be composed only of faceless officials. Although a new party of power, Belarus, won 51 out of 110 seats, it did not hold the majority in the parliament, as another 19 seats were to the three spoiler parties: the Republican Party of Law and Justice, the Communist Party, and the Liberal Democratic Party. The remaining seats were filled by independent MPs, who obtained 40 seats. The reactions of these elections, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya called for a boycott of the elections, saying that there is no people, quotation, there are no people on the ballot who would offer real changes because the regime only has allowed puppets convenient for it to take part, end of quotation. She also called on the international community not to recognize the results of the election. As for the Russian President Vladimir Putin, he congratulated Alexander Lukashenko on the confident victory of patriotic forces of Belarus, which he said, quotation, helped to ensure internal political stability, end of quotation. The United States Department of State condemned the elections, describing them as being held in a climate of fear under which no electoral processes could be called democratic. And finally, the implications. The 2024 Belarusian parliamentary elections demonstrated that Alexander Lukashenko is no longer interested in legitimizing his role in the eyes of the West. It was more important for him to convince himself that after the 2020 post-election protest, there were only a deviation, and that Belarusians returned to their senses and became an electoral discipline. Moreover, these elections have disputed the cycle pattern of Belarus domestic politics. The 2006, the 2010, and the 2020 presidential elections ended in mass protest. Those were followed by repressions, which are succeeded by political chaos. The latter enabled voters to mobilize around new opposition-minded leaders. This political pendulum has stalled. which elections, assuming the same role they played in the Soviet Union, since they ensure the continuation of the transition of the Belarusian hegemonic authoritarian regime into a Soviet totalitarian one, a fact demonstrated by the appearance of Belarusian People Assembly, an institution equivalent to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which will take over some of the powers held until now by the Belarusian Parliament, such as the right to issue legislative proposals, to organize referendums, or to question the legitimacy of the elections. This transition can be stopped only under two circumstances: new leadership in Belarus or escape from Russia's control. However, in my opinion, neither of these circumstances is likely to come to pass in the foreseeable future. Thank you.
By the end of time, thank you. Our third speaker is Dr. Wojciech Łysek from the Polish Academy of Sciences. He will speak on security dilemma, propaganda and misperception in the shadow of nuclear weapons, Belarus and its participation in a full-scale war on Ukraine.
Good morning, everyone. One moment. I have the presentation, so. Oh, yes, listen. Okay. So thank you very much for the opportunity to appear at the conference. I feel particularly appreciated by participating in the panel led by Professor Wilson. So it is also additional stressful situation for me. Yes. Neorealist, also called structural realist, emphasizes that feeling of state. The next slide, please. Emphasizes the feeling of fear. However, defensive realism emphasizes survival. Belarus' attitude can be explained by fear of survival dating back to the World War II. Defense realists believe that conflicts are caused by incorrect perception of the environment. They notice a lack of trust and fears between actors. Hence, in the anarchic system, no one can feel completely safe. It also related with security dilemma. What is the security dilemma? It expresses the existential condition of uncertainty, the beginning of the concept derived from the Cold War. John Hertz argued that the states armor and enter military alliances because they were afraid of their safety. But doing so, starting the arms race, international competition, and armed conflict. The safety dilemma occurs at the two levels: interpretation and the answer. Firstly, decision makers are center of the motives and intentions of other entities, because they cannot determine with certainty whether a specific military development will serve only defense purposes or can be used for attack. At the level of answer, decision makers face the problem of how to react in a decisive and confrontational way, for example, by deterrence, which will cause unplanned hostility, or calming by reassurance, risking that they will be under pressure for states that have enemy intention. In response to states can develop a spiral of mutual hostility, leads to the escalation of voltage and international destabilization. Next slide, please. Misperception is obvious concept. On the other hand, it is difficult to define, identify, and measure. There are two approaches. One indicates a discrepancy between perception and reality. It recognizes false perception as the result. The second, related to the decision-making process, is a departure from rational decision maker. From this point of view, misperception is a process. How available information leads to erroneous perception. The factor that most disrupt cognitive process is influence of an individual beliefs system on the observation and interpretation of information. People have a strong tendency to see what they expect based on their beliefs. Trends that disrupt cognition have important implications for foreign policy. If we are convinced that our opponent has hostile intentions and at the same time is sensitive to external trends and opportunities, we can perceive his aggressive action as initiate hostility. Another source of erroneous judgment is the interpretation of other people under the behavior. In international politics, this leads to the overestimation of the threat. As a result, the role of the security dilemma in international politics is neglected. Next slide, please. So, propaganda. What is propaganda? It should be defined as a means of misperception. According to definition found in English dictionaries, propaganda is information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, which often gives only one part of an argument. Disputes such as the New Cold War contribute to the distortion of reality. As a result, the truth is the first casualty, and states fall into a spiral model. Next slide, please. On the slide, we can see action justifying the weakening position of Belarus, although it may be seen that Lukashenko can also distance himself from Russia. Lukashenko interview for Associated Press. On the other hand, we can see the consistency of Belarusian wartime propaganda with the Russian message. This is a suggestion for supporters of the thesis about the subordination of Belarus by Russia. Yesterday, Radosław Sikorski, the Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs, said in Polish Parliament that Belarus have lost their independence and we can recognize it as evidence on destabilization of regional order. Next slide, please. Lukashenko refrained from the direct participation in the attack, but actively supported Russia in the ideological aggression. He repeated the thesis of Russian propaganda. We can see and listen numerous anti-Polish statements and action. For example, the establishment of National Unity Day. It is a result of Lukashenko's deeply rooted in anti-Polish phobias on post-Soviet fundament. Since 2022, the authorities of the Republic of Belarus have consistently pointed to Poland as the main enemy, striving to include Belarus in their sphere of influence. Following the negative rhetoric of Minsk, Polish education is being liquidated and activists of the Independent Union of Poles are being repressed. Moreover, Polish cemeteries were devastated in June 2021. In December 2023, Belarus amended the law restricting religious freedom, new strike the rules of activity. Its provision particularly hit the Catholic community dominated by the Polish minority. We can assume that the anti-Polish attitude is an element of yielding to Russian pressure. Looking more broadly, it should be assumed that there is a consequences an erroneous perception of the international environment and have its roots in the Soviet time. Next slide, please. The migration crisis began in the spring in 2021. At the time, migrants started the move from the territory of Belarus to Lithuania. Why? Lithuania's active policy of democracy, support for the opposition, and advocacy for the rule of law and human rights has become a source of reaction from authoritarian states. In 2021, the number of migrants grew sharply. You can see details on the slide. During the migration crisis, Belarus and Russia sharply criticized the attitude of the Polish and Lithuanian authorities towards migrants. They accused them of violating elementary human rights. The Suwałki Isthmus, the next issue, is a key area for the security of the entire region, the same as Fulda Gap for Germany in the period of the Cold War. During Russia-Belarusian exercises concern the isthmus or take place near it. In result, the level of security is lower. It introduced an element of uncertainty on NATO eastern flank. Hence, the Suwałki Isthmus can be considered as a barometer of tension level. In June 2022, Prigozhin rebellion took place. In not entirely clearly circumstances, Lukashenko cooled down emotion in Russian political elite and ended the rebellion. As a result, we can also notice not only common political misperception, as well the common political elite Russia and Belarus. In recent years, Vilnius and Warsaw have been to place of important events and initiative. It applies NATO and the Free Seas initiative. In response to the increasing threat from Belarus on two summits in Vilnius, the key issue was regional security and stretching NATO eastern flank. In addition to stationing allied troops, we cannot forget about the importance of the infrastructure units Central Europe, such as Via Carpathia and roads or railways between Poland and Ukraine. Next slide, please. According to the defensive allies, nuclear weapons can strengthen the stability of the international system and the chance for peace. The removal of the provision of the status of a nuclear weapon-free state from the Belarus constitution was a result of the referendum in February 2022. The leader of Belarus, in his speech at the end of March 2023, focused on the threats to the independence of state and the justification for deploying nuclear-armed missiles. He repeated Russian propaganda thesis and accused Poland of militarization and desire to attack Belarus. According to Lukashenka, the decision to deploy weapons will strengthen Belarus' independence. On the second hand, Vladimir Putin was the first incumbent who announced the deployment of nuclear weapons on Belarus. Explaining his action, the Russian president referred to the NATO precedent in the form of nuclear sharing. Putin referred to the nuclear sharing, but the program assumed the transfer of specific nuclear charge to the states in which they are located. Participants must maintain the technical capability to deliver nuclear weapons. Belarus does not have such opportunities. Putin's decision formally means an increase the role of Belarus as a Russian ally. In fact, this is a next proof of lack of sovereignty of Belarus. This will allow for greater interference in the internal affairs of the Republic of Belarus based on for the protection of a strategic installation. In this way, the Kremlin would gain access to the Belarus army in a desperate attempt to win the war in Ukraine. The President of the Republic of Poland stated in summer 2023 and April 2024 that Warsaw is ready to get involved in nuclear sharing. The presence of nuclear weapons on Polish territory isn't a new idea. The fact that Poland would like to join the program of nuclear sharing has been an open secret for some years. Experts agree that Poland will gain status first-class members of NATO. In response to President Duda, Russia begins to threaten. We should take no notice of it because recently Russia has been making threats several times a month. Despite concerns, the presence of several American nuclear devices reduced the risk of an attack on Poland. Nuclear weapons are first and foremost element of deterrence, and the next it can be an element of equipment for the armed forces. However, it is describes in model of the spiral. And last slide, please. Common Russian, Soviet, Belarusian history, culture, and tradition are basis for misperception and Lukashenko propaganda. While misperception and Lukashenko propaganda are caused security dilemma on the NATO's interest flank in 2024, in reality, not Poland or Lithuania, but Russia have been destroyed Belarusian independence. It appears that the West go into step-by-step to spiral model. It's obvious that participants Belarus in attack on Ukraine can be confirmation Belarusian subordination to Russia. On the other hand, the anti-Polish narration can be attempt to balancing Russia's influence. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our fourth speaker is Javier Silva from the Autonomous University of Chile, who will talk on exporting Belarusian hybrid warfare to South America.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I would like to share my screen, please. How can I share my screen? Okay, thank you. Okay. Okay, I will talk about exporting the hybrid warfare to South America. This research aims to identify points of continuity and rupture in the hybrid warfare carried out by the Minsk regime, starting from 2021 to destabilize the European Union, based on the use of migrant populations to pressure the European bloc in comparison with the situation in South America, where the regime of Nicolás Maduro, an ally of Alexander Lukashenko, export Venezuelan migrants with the aim of destabilizing South American democracy. Here you can see how the Venezuelan migrants are in the borders in different countries and the migrants in the border between Belarus and Poland. Thus, this strategy of using migrants to destabilize democracy in Europe has been exported by means to South America. Firstly, it's necessary to generate a brief definition of what will be understood as hybrid warfare. It should be noted that this concept is hard to define. There are several definitions. However, in the interest of the time, I will explain the NATO definition of hybrid warfare. So for the NATO, a wide range of over and cover military, paramilitary, and civilian measures are employed in highly integrated design. In the case of Latin America, research regarding hybrid warfare actions can be exemplified according to Fonseca Cortés proposed. For those authors, the hybrid war is a scenario where a series of governments and radical social movements promote chaos and instability in liberal democratic governments to impose their totalitarian interest, institutional vacuums, and forms that extraterritorial powers exploit to expand their sphere of influence in the region and alter the balance in the international geopolitical arena. So, about the diplomatic relations, during the 2000s, there was significant diplomatic and political exchange between dictators Lukashenko and Chavez. Evidence of this is that in late 2006, Hugo Chavez met with Alexander Lukashenko and called for the creation of a strategic alliance between both countries. However, these relations took a backseat once Hugo Chávez's successor, Nicolás Maduro, took control of the South American country. Just a few months ago, in the latest high-level meeting between representatives of the Chavista regime in Minsk, Lukashenko stated the following: both Venezuela and Belarus are poorly using the advantages that we created many years ago. I want to say that it's not about the sanctions that have been introduced against Venezuela and Belarus. We have a very serious, powerful groundwork for our cooperation established during the presidency of Hugo Chávez. While it may seem that the relation between both countries are not that they were during the time when dictator Hugo Chávez was alive, Nicolás Maduro's Chavista regime does consider Belarus as a relevant actor in its foreign policy. On April 8, 2019, 5 years ago, the national project Simón Bolívar, Third Socialist Plan for Economic and Social Development of the Nation 2019-2025 was published. This plan is still in effect. In this document, which serves as a guide for the regime, there is a national objective 4.3, which refers to continuing to promote the development of a multicentric and multipolar world without imperial domination and with respect for the self-determination of peoples. In its subsection 4.3.1.3, it indicates continuing to work toward higher levels of alliances with the People's Republic of China, the Russian Federation, the Republic of Turkey, the Republic of Belarus, and in defense against external interference expressed on the legal schemes of sanctions and blockade imposed on the Venezuelan people. Determining starting the date for the use of migrants as weapons by the Minsk regime could be a complex exercise, given Lukashenko's repeated use of migratory flows towards the European Union after receiving some form of sanction. Since 1996, Belarus has been subject to sanctions from both the United States and European Union, while Lukashenko's use of migrants can be dated back to 2002. However, for the purposes of this analysis, activities involving migrants will be considered from the year 2021, following the sanctions imposed due to the fraudulent presidential election held in 2020. Belarus utilizes migrants as political instruments against sanctions or to justify its legitimacy. This constitutes coercive engineering migration, which refers to cross-border population movements deliberately created or manipulated to induce political, military, or economic concessions from a target state or states. If migration is intentional or manipulated, it becomes a strategy, including its use for political, military, or economic reasons. On September 15, 2021, Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, stated that this is a hybrid attack to destabilize Europe. A couple of months later, she added on her Twitter account that they opposed the hybrid threat being carried out by the Belarus and will act in 4 areas: humanitarian support, diplomatic outreach to countries of origin, sanctions, and border protection. The Belarusian Polish migrant crisis was the culmination of the transnational use of state-organized migration and the instrumentalization, weaponization, way beyond the use of immigration as a method of migration diplomacy. But what is the situation in migrants like in Venezuela? The Chavista regime in Venezuela began in 1998 when Hugo Chavez came to power through democratic election, relying on a populist discourse that ultimately undermined the institutions of liberal democracy, resulting in an authoritarian regime to the present day. In 2014, USA imposed a series of economic sanctions on the country. In addition to this, in 2016, Venezuela faced the decline in the price of oil, its main commodity, which exacerbated the crisis. Since then, there has been a sustained increase in immigration. This combination of factors has led to a significant outflow of Venezuelan migrants seeking refuge and opportunities in neighboring countries, particularly in the Andean region of South America. Unfortunately, this influx of migrants has also been accompanied by an increase in crime rates in the Andean countries. The Interagency Coordination Platform for Refugees and Migrants, known as R4UB, which is made of more than 200 organizations, indicates on its website that as August 2023, 6.5 million of people have emigrated from Venezuela to Central and South America. 42% of Venezuelan migrants in the American continent emigrated after May 2021. Since then, the democratic governments of South America has begun to experience increase in crime rates among their inhabitants, explained by the clashes between drug trafficking gangs, hitmen, and kidnappers. Former Chilean Defense Minister Mario Desbordes stated on TV that Venezuela made a plan to release criminals from prisons and send them to countries like Peru, Ecuador, and Chile. A brief overview of the internal security situation in Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Chile reveals some insight into what is happening in this society. However, Venezuela has seen a reduction in its homicide rates, decreasing from 34.9 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants in 2021 to 26.8 in 2023, as reported by the Venezuelan Violence Observatory. The international consulting firm Ipsos conducted a survey in 29 countries where people were asked about their greatest concerns. In May 2021, 51% of Chileans and 39% of Peruvians responded that crime and violence was one of the 3 most worrying issues in their countries. However, in March 2024, the figures rose to 62% and 61% respectively. However, despite the evidence regarding the use of migrant population to destabilize the region, decision makers in South America do not refer to the issue as a hybrid warfare strategies. So, what are the common points of hybrid warfare in Europe and South America? So far, the review has shown that the characteristic of immigration both in Belarus and Venezuela, there are differences that are evident and can be appreciated given the social context in which they arise or by the way migrants are placed in the border of the countries. While Belarus mobilizes migrants from African or Middle Eastern countries, Venezuela will employ its own nationals for destabilization, exporting its criminal gangs, which would partly explain the increase in crime in democratic South American countries. The points of continuity that will explain why Belarus exported this hybrid warfare strategy to South America through Venezuela could be explained by the following factor. One, Belarus has been using migrants as weapons for over 20 years. As I mentioned in the section of the definition hybrid warfare, in the case of South America, there are institutional voids both internally and externally in which extraterritorial powers, whether totalitarian or non-democratic, take advantage to deploy their interests in the region. Three, from the previous point, a fact emerges: the Venezuelan regime recognizes Belarus as an ally in which it must strengthen relations. These relations are also related to how to act in the face of sanctions. Fourth, Belarus uses migrants as retaliation for sanctions. The same could be explained with Venezuela, which also faces a series of sanctions aimed at weakening the regime. Both countries have achieved their goals with varying degrees of success. While the European Union recognizes that this is facing a threat aimed at destabilizing its democracies, leaders of democratic South American countries do not refer to the Venezuelan migration phenomenon as a hybrid warfare strategy. Therefore, it's necessary to create coordination, for example, coordination mechanism between the European Union and South America to face the global threat. Finally, new researches on the topic should include more actors, for example, Russia, China, Iran, are key to understanding how they act in coordination to destabilize free countries in Europe and other parts of the world. In the case of Latin America, research should include Cuba, Nicaragua, Bolivia, and Brazil, which have also demonstrated ties with those seeking to undermine the institutions of free society beyond their border. This is my presentation, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Our final paper is by Dr. Adrian-Bogdan Ceobanu and Laurențiu Pleșca from Cold Relations to Intense Activity, Romanian Diplomatic Representation in Belarus. The two are from the Universities of Iași and Bucharest, but I think only one of you will speak.
I will read the first part, and my colleague the second part of our presentation. We have also PowerPoint presentation. Yeah. Thank you. It's up. The study examines the evolution of Romanian diplomatic relations with Belarus, focusing on the period 1991 to 2023. In the geography of Romanian diplomatic post after 1990s, its diplomatic mission in the Republic of Belarus did not play an important role. After the recognition of independence on 20 December 1991 and the establishment of diplomatic relations 2 months later, on February 1992, Bucharest decided to appoint as the first stage a chargé d'affaires. The next slide. From July 1993, Romania appointed an ambassador extraordinary and minister plenipotentiary to the Republic of Belarus. In fact, from the time his mission in Minsk ended in 1996 until 2015, Romania was represented only at the level of chargé d'affaires. And in the first days after the opening the embassy, the diplomatic mission consisted only of the ambassador and the first-class secretary. Therefore, it was a small embassy without relevance for Romanian foreign policy in the first decade after 1990. The next one. The research highlights a significant shift in the role and activities of the Romanian embassy in Belarus, beginning from the 2020 protest. The embassy's response to the Belarusian political crisis following the presidential elections in August same year marks a more intense approach. Romanian Foreign Minister Bogdan Aulescu expressions of concern and call for political dialogue and non-violence, along with the embassy active support for peaceful protests and civil society, marked a new level of engagement. the allocation of 100,000 euros to support Belarusian civil society and independent media, and the solidarity shown by Ambassador, or Romanian Ambassador, of course, Gabriel Moșanu, in safeguarding opposition figures, such as the last opposition leader in country, Belarusian writer Svetlana Alexievich, underscore a transformation in Romanian diplomatic approach toward Belarus. The study argues that these events not only reflect a shift in Romanian foreign policy priorities, but also indicate a broader transformation in the character of Romanian diplomatic in Eastern Europe. The research is based on a review of diplomatic documents, official statements, and media coverage. The next one. 2 months after the collapse of Soviet Union, the authorities from Bucharest decided on February 1992 to establish diplomatic relations with the Republic of Belarus and to appoint a chargé d'affaires. In fact, this was also the policy of Romania towards other states from the former Soviet space, such as Ukraine and the Republic of Moldova, to appoint in a first stage chargé d'affaires. It was decided to send Nicolae Stânea, a career diplomat of Romania, to Minsk. Born on August 26, 1944, he graduated the Institute of International Relations in Bucharest in 1958, and he was accepted to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Romania in the same year. He knows very well English, Russian, and Hungarian. He held various positions in Romanian diplomatic service, in the central administration and abroad to the embassy in Moscow, Budapest, and Tirana. Moreover, between 1979 and 1990, he worked at the embassy in Moscow, and then being director of the Committee of Independent States and Baltic States Directorate with the central administration. So the authorities in Bucharest decided to send a diplomat who knew very well the Russian languages and the ex-Soviet space. Stânea remained as chargé d'affaires until the summer of the following year, when by decree of July 6, 1993, he was appointed ambassador extraordinary and minister plenipotentiary to the Republic of Belarus. Moreover, in the summer of the same year, the first Romanian ambassadors were also sent to Chișinău and Kiev. So we can speak of a concerted policy of the Bucharest authorities towards the former ex-Soviet space. For Stânea, it was the first appointment as ambassador. Moreover, the only one in his diplomatic career. According to the Romanian diplomatic yearbook for the year 1994, in addition to Stânea, the embassy also included only the one first-class secretary, Traian Bordeanu. He also knew the ex-Soviet space because he worked in the embassy of Moscow between 1981 and 1984. The next one. During the 4 years, Stânea was head of the embassy in Minsk, first as chargé d'affaires and then as ambassador. The relations between Romania and Belarus were quite intense, marked by several high-level visits. The one of Ion Iliescu, the president of Romania in Minsk in July 1992 and March 1994. The one of the president of the Parliament of the Republic of Belarus in Romania in May 1993, in April 1994. And at the level of the Prime Minister of the Republic of Belarus in Romania in May 1995. And of course, at the level of foreign ministers in Bucharest in 1992 and March 1993. Also, in May 1993, the Treaty of Friendship and Collaboration between Romania and the Republic of Belarus was signed by the president of the two states, Ion Iliescu and Stanislav Suškevici. In the same year, in May, the Consular Convention between the two states was signed in Bucharest in 49 articles. The next one. In 1996, Stânea was recalled to Bucharest, and from that year until 2015, Romanian diplomatic representation in Minsk was carried out only at the level of chargé d'affaires. In chronological order, they were, and you have also the list, Leontin Pastor, Gheorghe Pahonea, Mihai Baciu, Dumitru Preda, Constantin Eremia, and Moldovan Sorin. With the exception of Mihai Baciu, all were career diplomats, working for decades in Romanian diplomacy. The next one. The previous one, sorry. Regarding Mihai Baciu, he was an outsider. Professor of the Faculty of the Philosophy of the Alexandru Ioan Cuza University of Iași, he was a deputy in the Romanian Parliament at the time of his appointment to Minsk. Therefore, his appointment was strictly political. After retiring from the post in Minsk, he published several press articles about the period of his stay in Belarus. Asked why he accepted the post in Belarus, he replied that he knew about the cooling of relations between the two states, thinking that, and I quote, "It is worth trying to improve these relations between the two countries separated by only one more country, Ukraine." And I end the quote. He admitted that he had only partially succeeded. One of the reasons, the different political regime between Romania and Belarus. In 2015, by the decree, and the next slide, on August 11, 2015, Gabriel Moșanu was officially appointed as ambassador of Romania in the Republic of Belarus, and 2 months later, on October 5, he handed the credentials to the President of the Republic of Belarus. Who is Gabriel Moșanu? He's a Romanian diplomat. He was born in 1965 in Chișinău, was initially the Vice Consul of the Soviet Union Consulate in Iași, then Secretary of the Embassy of the Republic of Moldova in Bucharest during 1992 and 1994. But after obtaining Romanian citizenship, he entered the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Romania in the mid-2000. Before he was appointed to Minsk, he was deputy head of mission in the Romanian embassy to Ukraine. So he knew very well the ex-former Soviet space.
The next slide, please. Over time, strategic conversations and context have shaped the diplomatic relationship between Belarus and Romania, reflecting the two countries developing dynamics and shared goal in fortifying their bilateral relations. That was the year of 2015. After that, in the months that followed, Belarus and Romania's conversation widened considerably. In April 2015, department heads meetings were placed in Minsk and covered a wide range of subjects, including bilateral ties, Belarus interaction with the European Union, and cooperation with international organizations. The discussions have expanded to cover consular matters only by October 2015. In May 2015, Gabriel Moșanu was interviewed by the Foreign Policy Committee on the Romanian Parliament, receiving the approval for occupying the position of ambassador. But what is important is that during the hearing, the Romanian diplomat emphasized also that the Ukrainian crisis, that was after the annexation of Crimea, the Ukrainian crisis and the aggressive policy of the Russian Federation created a keen concern for the leadership in Minsk to ensure the country's independence and sovereignty. Romania also's participation in the Eastern Partnership emphasized how important it is to the EU ability to work with the 6 post-Soviet governments of Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. Romania has been a useful asset to the European External Action Service in carrying out the EU's Eastern Partnership strategy, which was launched in 2009. The country draws on its unique experience as a former member of the Eastern Bloc and its existing diplomatic connections with these states, including Belarus. And in the Eastern Partnership, Romania plays a strategic and active role that helps the EU in its attempts to bring Belarus and other post-Soviet republics closer. But one important aspect of this proactiveness of Romania since the creation of the Eastern Partnership is the fact that Romania participated at the Belarus civil society with its Minister of Foreign Affairs, Teodor Baconski. Romania participated in the International Donor Conference for Belarus, organized on 2nd of February 2011 in Warsaw. And this conference aims to explore avenues for providing both political and financial support to civil society in Belarus. Please, the next slide. But the Romanian embassy response to the Belarusian political crisis following the presidential elections in August 2020 marks a more intense approach for the relations of Romania and Belarus, because Romanian Foreign Minister Bogdan Aurescu's expression of concern and call for political dialogue and non-violence, along with the embassy's active support for peaceful protest and civil society signaled a new level of engagement because the allocation of support to Belarusian society and independent media was something unprecedented, and also the solidarity shown by Ambassador Moșanu in safeguarding opposition figures such as the last opposition leader in country, the Belarusian writer Svetlana Alexievich, underscore a transformation in Romania's diplomatic approach towards Belarus. And in addition, in October 2020, Romania, along with Poland and Lithuania, proposed an economic support plan for democratic Belarus. Recently, this plan was endorsed at the European Union level, and also Romania provided backing to civil society and independent media with a contribution of 100,000. But this is just a small figure because Romania also supported an international platform dedicated to investigating instances of torture and mistreatment by authorities against its protesters. But one important point, turning point, is the accusations that have been leveled against the Lukashenko government for conducting arbitrary arrests for the protest in 2020. And this was the case of Nobel laureate in the field of literature and member of the Presidium of the Coordination Council of the Belarusian Opposition, Svetlana Alexievich. She said at that time, when she was at her house, Svetlana Alexievich had European diplomats stationed at her home for protection, including Romanian Ambassador Moșanu, that arrived at her home, the first one, and after that, the other diplomats came to her home to safeguard her integrity. And I will quote something that writer Alexievich said: "There are no longer any of my like-minded friends left in the Presidium of the Coordination Council. Everyone is either in jail or thrown abroad. First, our country was stolen from us. The best of us are being kidnapped. But in place of those plucked from our ranks will come hundreds of others. It is not the Coordination Committee that has risen, the country has risen." Romania has taken a decisive diplomatic step in solidarity with Lithuania because there was this decision after this protest to recall the Romanian ambassador in Minsk, Gabriel Moșanu. This was a gesture of solidarity because other diplomats from Germany, from Poland, from Lithuania, they recalled also their ambassadors from Minsk. And in conclusion, I will say that we are very proud of the activity of Ambassador Moșanu. Now he's been appointed in 2022 as the special representative for the South Caucasus of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And we analyzed also lots of diplomatic documents and reflected his work in Belarus. Thank you for the attention.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Question time. If I may, could I ask the first question to Javier Silva? You talked about export of the Belarusian model of weaponizing migrants to Venezuela. So what do you mean by export? Is it copying? Is it cooperation? Is it Belarusian tutelage, organizational help? What's the nature of the transfer of the practice from one country to another?
This is a very interesting question because in my investigation, I think it's like a more cooperation. I mean, if we consider the Venezuelan diplomatic relation with Belarus, we can see that they are so close relationship, diplomatic relationship. So it could be more certain that it's more than cooperation in strategy. So to refuse the economical sanction that Venezuela has as well in similar like a Belarus. So that's it could be the answer. I think more than a copy on other things. I think it's more certain to say that it's a cooperation in that strategy, how to export the migrants, and how to export the model, how to pressure to put pressure in the another democracies in the neighborhood countries.
Okay, thank you. David, question for you as well. there's a famous article by Lucan Way where he calls Kebich an inefficient authoritarian and a bit of a drunk. And that's his explanation of how Lukashenko came to power, not Lukashenko's own virtues or allies, but the fact that Kebich wasn't able to use the kind of levers of power as efficiently as he later became. How would you position your study in relation to that?
I think
Let's use the mic.
yes. Yeah, it's a good question. I think Kebich was genuinely unpopular by this stage and regarded as one of the more corrupt people in the government. And I think the populace was generally concerned about corruption. I don't really foresee Kebich being the sort of personality who would be around too long. And I think also you had this group of fairly young people who had not been corrupted, who seemed to be fairly clean. They were not necessarily part of the Communist Party structure. I mean, Lukashenko wasn't. They were outsiders in many ways. And I think there was a hope in the electorate that they would see real changes coming in Belarus, that this group at the top would all be removed. And it wasn't particularly Kebich, but I think you're quite right that he was sort of the symbol. And yet within the parliament, he could have been removed at the same time as Shushkevich. I mean, there was a vote to remove them both, but he had enough support in the parliament to stay there. That's really the only reason. But I think in terms of the country as a whole, he was just as unpopular as most of the people around in that hierarchy.
Okay, thank you. If you're online, please put your questions in the chat and we'll collect them at the end. But questions in the room. Please identify yourself before asking a question. You, of course, can ask a question, Peter. Any questions? Yes, please.
Name and affiliation, and then the question.
You don't have to introduce yourself as you have already done so.
Yeah, I'm the panelist, and my name is Wei Tang. Yeah, I came from Oxford, and my question is about Lukashenko regime, because after the dissolution of Soviet Union, the Union states is very fast established. So Lukashenko is very rapidly faced with a very dire circumstance where he seems to have little room for his own agency. But it seems like paradoxically that his dictatorship become more and more intense. So I'm just wondering how these two tendencies seems like a contradiction, but existed in the same time. Professor Marples, would you like to answer this question?
Oh, sorry, I was thinking there's only one microphone, but obviously we got two microphones. So, yes, thank you very much. I think it's a valid question about immediately the Russia-Belarus Union. Lukashenko was always a big supporter of closer relations with Russia. And I think he exploited the fact that for many Belarusians could not anticipate that their state could actually survive without backing from Russia. At that stage, in the early 1990s, it was not conceivable to many in the electorate as well that they could sort of suddenly break off relations. And this is why, for some Belarusians, Pasniak was regarded as a kind of extremist. Someone way out to the far right, if you like, who thought that Belarus could actually break away And if you look at the background of the Popular Front, I mean, they were such a minority that they couldn't even have their founding Congress inside Belarus. Like, for example, the Popular Movement in Ukraine, in Kiev, had theirs in 1988. But the one in Belarus had to go to Vilnius to have their Congress because they were not allowed to do so in their own country. And I think it took a long time before Belarusians really began to think that perhaps there was some logic to having their own state separate from Russia. There was a real fear, in my view, of what could happen to them if they didn't cling to this Russian agency, particularly for getting oil and gas and other resources from Russia, where they were very dependent at first. They had no nuclear power station, for example. They had no alternative sources of energy. And they had been very closely tied, even with machine building, the main industry, very closely tied to Russia, Ukraine, and other republics, rather than going alone. So he took a big step to do that. And I think Lukashenko realized that right away. Someone like Shushkevich, he was kind of in the middle. He thought, no, we can't have this union with Russia because we'll be giving up independence. But at the same time, I'm supporting close relations with Russia as well. You've got to kind of have both in there. So I think Lukashenko was really committed to Russia initially, very, very close to Russia. On the other hand, my view is that Lukashenko was a political chameleon, and I actually said that in the paper, and he could be on any position at any time. So at one stage, people thought he was part of the Popular Front, and I talked to Grushevoy, who you mentioned in your paper. He told me that he thought Lukashenko was a social democrat in the late 1980s, early 90s, and other people who think he's a hardline communist. So nobody knows where he is. And I think that's always a good advantage for a politician, that nobody actually knows where you stand. Doesn't always work, but I think in this case it did.
Three questions. Paul, and then the gentleman in the reddish top.
Hi, I'm Paul Hansbury. I'm from the University of Warwick. Two quick questions, if I may. First one is to Dr. Łysek. I just wanted a point of clarification on something that you said. You mentioned about Prigozhin's mutiny, and you spoke of some misperception, and I was wondering who was misperceiving what during the mutiny, if you could just elaborate on that. And for Robert Țicălău, you looked at the word totalitarianism was in the title of your paper. You were very focused on the election. I wondered how far you had looked at aspects or evidence of totalitarianism in society beyond the electoral process. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Peter, could we get this gentleman's question as well?
Jakob Wunderwald from the University of Potsdam. I have a question for Mr. Silva, I think it is. Because maybe also mainly for clarification. Was the claim of your research that there is an actual like transfer of knowledge going on this like what you call a hybrid warfare using migrants between Belarus and Venezuela, or is this more like a parallel or something that like, I don't know, dictatorships use in the 21st century? Or is it like, because at a point I thought you were saying that this is something thought out in Belarus and then, brought over consciously to Venezuela. How is the dynamic here? Thank you.
Rather similar to my question. Could I just ask Paul to repeat his question to Robert Gabriel Țicălău?
The question to
Could you repeat the question, Paul?
the question to Wojciech. Yeah. You said that there was a misperception around the Prigozhin mutiny. I just wasn't clear what you meant by what was being misperceived, who was misperceiving, and what were they misperceiving. And it was a small point. I mean, maybe it's not worth dwelling on in this.
And repeat the question too.
Oh, sorry, I'm not expressing myself very clearly as usual.
Could be at both ends.
You were talking about totalitarianism, but you were very focused on the election that happened. I just wondered how far you saw signs of totalitarianism in society outside of elections.
No. Oh.
Yeah.
Understood?
Yeah. Okay. I only analyze the election, what happened before the elections and after. Yeah, because in my opinion, the transition of hegemonic authoritarian regime in Belarus started after the referendum in 2022. Yeah, when this institution, Belarus People's Assembly, appeared, and in my opinion, this institution is as a sort of communist party of the Soviet Union. And after that institution came into force, Belarus regime will modify. It will become more autocratic. It will become a true dictatorship, a Soviet totalitarian regime after these elections.
Thank you. Over to you.
If I could understand, ask, I can see a problem with what Lukashenka said and act, and what he want. Yes, because in the international relations we have high level of perspective. Yes, and it was so Lukashenka said, and we in Poland or in the West we listen anti-Polish propaganda, but this must be message to the Russian, not to West. So maybe I want to talk with you and more. Yes, it is better. So maybe.
Andrew had a call at 45, so he had to leave. There's one more last question, right?
I have a question.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah, please go ahead, Javier.
Yeah, thank you. So this is a very good question because I like to demonstrate how the illiberal regimes work together. So here in South America, we are under a hybrid attack. So in similar way, like in European Union. But here the problem is that the decision makers don't see that threat. Like for example, here in Chile or Peru, they only focused the threat. They threaten like violence, like dragging gangs, for example, but they don't see that here we are under a similar strategy, like in Belarus, for example, with the European Union. So I think this is the challenge of my investigation because, for example, here in South America, the academic research about this topic is there are few papers, for example, studying the hybrid warfare in South America. While we have a lot of migrants pressure our borders, not only in the USA, for example, here in Chile in the north, because it's there is a lot of migrants. So this is a keyword. It's a key point to understand how the illiberal regime, the totalitarian regime, works together. In relation, in connection around the world. So that's it will be the focus of the claims of my research in this topic in general.
Thank you very much. So one final question in the room before we conclude this panel. There are no questions from. Oh no, there's a question from Pavel as well. So here in the room, and then Pavel, that will be there. And introduce yourself, please.
Hi, so I'm Ignas Tankaitis. I have no university affiliation. I'm just here to observe. but I had a question for anyone on the panel who would like to answer. Well, what I'm curious about is what kind of diplomatic and economic tools we have to increase democratic values in Belarus, especially as time goes on and relations with Russia intensify and the more dictatorial power is obtained by Lukashenka. So what kind of tools do we have apart from physical intervention to increase democracy in Belarus?
Thank you. And Pavel? Pavel Shustov, are you still interested in asking a question? I don't think it disappeared. All right, so let's just deal with this question. Who wants to tackle it? Maybe you had the story about Romanian diplomacy, what sort of options they had and what are the limits?
Yeah, as I mentioned in our presentation, one of the tools to bring Belarus closer to the democratic values is to support civil society, to support the civil society actors that are in exile, for example, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, but also to support independent media, because when the 2020 protests broke, we saw that every European state was donating money, not for the Belarusian state, for the government, but through independent means, and also to support not civil society in exile, but also civil society that is based in the country. But of course, this support needs to be more accurate to endanger the lives of the actors that are in the country and are working, are like grassroots organizations and are supporting independent values. So yeah.
David wanted to add a few words.
Yeah, I like the question because I think there's a perception in some states today of Belarusians as close partners with Russia and identified with Russia. And I think it's very important for leaders to realize that, in fact, there are two Belaruses today. There's official Belarus, and there is, let's say, at least prospective democratic Belarus, most of which is outside the country. And if you adopt the attitude that any Belarusian in exile is ipso facto sort of close to the Lukashenko regime, and there are many, many instances of things like this happening. I've heard of Belarusians being refused gas in Lithuania, petrol, when filling up their cars, simply because they see the Belarusian license plates. And you have to realize, I think, that there is real aspiration for democracy in Belarus. That was obvious in 2020. It's been completely repressed within the country by shoving everybody in jail or forcing them into exile. Well, then we have to listen to the exiles, and we have to think of means to communicate. I mean, not so long ago, a group from Tikhanovskaya managed to, sort of cyberpunks, they call themselves, they managed to infiltrate the, what do they call them, the screens that are in metro stations. And she appeared on there very suddenly in the middle of the day, making a message. I mean, it's just an example of how you can do that. It's not impossible to penetrate this regime. It's vulnerable to many things. And Lukashenko is not securely in power. He's never felt securely in power since 2020, and because he's not a legitimate leader. And I think this is how he should be treated, as someone who's not legitimate. Don't negotiate with him, but there are others you can negotiate with. And I think it's important to do that.
Thank you very much. I agree that distinguishing between Belarus and Russia is one important point. The other one is not to paint all Belarusians with one color. And unfortunately, the European Union is doing it even on official level. They introduce sanctions against all Belarusian citizens, for example. Yeah, so those who do not live in Belarus and who are not citizens of the European Union, they cannot invest, for example, in euro-denominated securities. So all people who live here, let's say even my kids who happen to have Belarusian passports in addition to other passports, they are by default guilty of being Belarusians, and they are targeted by the European Union, which in my view, it makes no sense.